Okay, welcome everyone. Let's get started. I know some people are still coming in, but I'd like to use the time available because what we're going to talk about today is dynamic configuration upload or refreshes with Spring. So what I bring to you here on this slide is a little bit of Dutch art, actually. This is MC Escher, with a little bit of a Greek expression. Panta rhei actually means everything flows, so it means nothing remains the same, right? You can have a single thing, but over time it will be different, and this is true for configuration as well. Every application has some sort of configuration, and that allows you to have one build, like could be your fat jar or your container image or whatever it happens to be in how you deploy your applications. But then you can change the way that it acts and behaves by changing the configuration that is separate from the application itself, of course, and we know about this. And a good reason to do this is that you have environment-specific configuration, right? The way that you connect to your production database is probably not going to use the same JDBC URL as your staging environment, for example. And there are many examples that will differ over environments. But obviously, you can also have changes that happen within an environment, right? Maybe my database credential has been updated. I need to rotate my credential. Or I want to change some configuration settings for my cache or some feature flags, basically, that I want to update. And this is exactly the topic that I'm going to be discussing here in this talk. Changes that are made within a running application within an environment. Because what's important to realize is that with Spring, configuration is read at startup. And for this, Spring has this notion of the environment. Basically, it's your application context that has a list of property sources. And properties can come from different things. It can come from class path or your file system or external configuration. I'm going to show you some examples. And then based on that, the application knows what to do. But because it's read at startup, it also means that changes, at least by default, will not be visible. You can try to change a configuration file in your file system, but your application doesn't know, doesn't care until you actually restart the whole thing. So that means that very often the way that we all work with this is that to effectuate any changes in configuration, you have to restart your application. And this is not always a good thing, because you're going to lose a lot of things. Obviously, you're going to lose availability. Your application needs to go down and come back up. So you're forced to run multiple instances and do like a rolling restart if you want to stay available. You lose all of the in-memory state that you might have built up while running your application. This could be stuff like in-memory caches, for example. All of that is gone when you have to restart. But in the keynote, we also saw that you lose actually a lot of state that the JVM has built up. So everything that your just-in-time compiler has done for you is gone. And this can have very significant effects. Actually, we saw again in the keynote some slides where we saw that it can take like over 30 seconds for your application to warm up. Actually, I think that's optimistic. That's only when you have an application that does like the same thing very often and the JIT immediately kicks in. I have some integration services myself where it can take hours actually for the application to become as fast in making remote calls to another system that involves XML handling as it was before I restarted the application, and all of that is gone, right? So that's a little bit sad, as we can see here. So what if I told you that there's a better way, right? You don't actually have to restart your applications just to pick up some configuration changes. And to stay in the theme, because actually this is from a movie from last century, so who knows that one. But they did a reload of that. And I'm going to talk about config reloads. That's exactly the topic here. So what does it mean to do configuration reloads in Spring? Turns out that there is a project called Spring Cloud Context. So Spring Cloud is like this umbrella of projects, but at the core, there is a common module that includes something called Spring Cloud Context. And this one actually provides support for reloading configuration dynamically. It provides a couple of things. One thing that not a lot of people know about, what I'm going to show you, is that you can actually make it so that the environment actuator endpoints, which is a standard boot endpoint for seeing the environment with all of its property sources, it becomes writable. So you can actually post configuration updates. Not the typical way that you would want to use it in a production situation, because it's going to be just an ephemeral change. Whenever you restart your application, the change is gone again. But nice for certain use cases in staging environments. What happens if you do this is that any beans that you may have that are annotated with configuration properties, so configuration is bound to them, will be rebound. So it's the same object still, but it gets new values that will be visible at runtime in your application. You can also change log levels with this. Not a super important use case because the actuator already provides a dedicated endpoint for updating logging. But it's interesting because you can also do this for when you actually make a change to your static configuration. So you can change your configuration on the file system in an external property or something like that. And then you can tell your application, I want you to refresh. And this is typically how you would use this stuff. It does the same thing as posting to the environment, so it will make sure that configuration properties are rebound. But it does a couple of other things as well. You can see some things here like refresh scope and stuff. I'm actually going to explain this based on a little demo. So what I've prepared is an application here that is a very simple Spring MVC app. And let me show you what it has. It has two configuration properties classes, right? So this is an example of one of those add configuration properties classes. You can see it has a prefix, which is called mutable config, and then it has a single property called key, and it has a getter and a setter, hence it's mutable. We also have an immutable version. It has a constructor and a getter, but not a setter. And both of these things are injected, I'll make this a bit bigger, in my controller here. So you can see I have a REST controller, or it's not actually a REST controller, it's a standard Spring MVC controller here. It gets these two configuration classes. It's also injected with an add value to show that we can also just do that. Then these three sources of configuration are put in an object and we render it, and I think this thing is already running, so let me show you. If I go to my browser now, we can refresh, and this is what we get. We get this nicely styled application because I'm a backend developer. And we can see basic key, mutable config key, and we can see some values. These values are all called blah, blah, blah from file system application properties. The reason for that is that if we go back to the application here, we can see that next to the application properties that I have on the class path, I have an application properties here. And this is the one that has that configuration that we just saw rendered in my app. But right now, this application doesn't have anything enabled for reloading. It doesn't use Spring Cloud or anything. So I can make a change here. I can say update it, and then I can try refresh, but obviously nothing will happen. Right? I need to restart to see this change. So what can we do to make it so that we can actually see changes that I make to this file? So if we go to the POM, then you will see that I have a commented out dependency here on something called Spring Cloud Starter. And I'm going to enable this one. And actually, because I want to do some other stuff as well, I'm going to do that by quickly switching to a commit like this. And then what we'll see is that we now have the, scroll up a bit. We now have the Spring Cloud Starter enabled like this. And what we'll see is when I now restart my application, this still works. But now when I go to the overview of my actuators here, so this is the actuator endpoint that shows a list of whatever is available, it will show that there is now here a refresh endpoint that wasn't there before. And what I can do is I can call into this refresh endpoint to make sure that my application updates its configuration. So let's give that a try, right? Let's first see what my current configuration is. It's still the same. It's all like that. But now I'm going to go into my file-based application properties, and I'm going to update this. I'm going to say it's updated. Just changing the file itself doesn't do anything yet, right? I can refresh, and again, it's still the same. I need to actively call this refresh endpoint to trigger my application to say I want you to reread your configuration state. For that, we can post to that refresh endpoint. And to do that, I'm using this IntelliJ HTTP file. You can see it has a post here to localhost 8080. I'm going to do that. And what's already interesting to see is what the response is to this request. The response is a 200 OK, but it also tells me what changed. And you can see that it picked up on the fact that I changed this mutable key. But that's the only thing. I didn't change the other properties, so this is the only one returned. I can see something similar actually in the logs of my application itself. You can see here that it refreshed the keys for mutable config key. And now when I go back to my browser and I refresh, I do actually see the new value. Notice this thing. This says number of calls. This is just an atomic integer. That's a counter in my controller. So it adds 1 whenever I could do a refresh, right? You can see it going up. This is to show you that I didn't actually restart anything. This is still the same controller, right? It went from 6 to 7. It didn't reset to 1. So this is proof, if you want, that this stuff actually works. Let me try something else. We also have an immutable configuration key. So let me update that one. So I'll go into my application properties here, and I'm going to say, let's update this one. And while we're at it, let's also update the basic key, right? I have updated all 3 now. We're going to call the refresh endpoint first, of course. So we do that here. Then we go into the browser, we press refresh, nothing, right? I don't actually see my changes here. The reason for that is that Spring has actually updated the environment. Let me first show you that. If we go to, let's open up a new one here, localhost 8080/actuator/env, I can see the current environment here. And if I search, for example, for the immutable stuff, I do actually see here that my value is now immutable config updated. The thing is, this thing is injected into my controller. And if we go back to the controller, you can see that it has, first of all, this basic key field, which is injected directly. So if I don't restart my controller itself, I won't be able to see any changes to the basic key, because I'm not just extracting the configuration from the environment or anything. I'm just injecting it at startup when the thing is created. And with the immutable configuration, it's basically the same thing. This object is not mutable, so it cannot be rebound, basically. This is a huge limitation, of course, if this was the only thing that you would be able to do. You would just be able to see changes to basically this. However, fortunately, there is a better way of doing this, because what we can do is we can use a new annotation that is provided by Spring Cloud called @refreshScope. And when we do that, we will actually be able to basically reload all configuration. And I'm going to quickly demo that and then explain how it works. So let me go to this. And what we'll see then is if we go back to the controller, it's now annotated with @refreshScope, right? Similarly, I've also done that, yeah, I think I have here, in the immutable config here. So again, the immutable configuration is now also annotated with @refreshScope. My application is still running before I restart it, so I can pick up on these changes. I want to quickly show you one thing. You may be familiar that there is also a config props endpoint in the actuators, where you can see your configuration properties beans and the values that are bound to them. So here I can look for my immutable configuration properties. I can see the values. It's a bit hard to see because there is so much information there. But actually you can also zoom in on a particular property, right? We do that here. So you can see here in the URL, I'm just asking for only the configuration of my immutable config, and I can see this here. So keep this in mind. This works as you would expect right now, but now I'm going to restart my application. I'm going to pick up on the refresh scope stuff. So let's restart. Go into my application properties here. So my current values are this, right? I've reset them all to the default values. So that's exactly what we should be seeing if I go back to my app here and I refresh. So there we go. Number of calls is 1. Let me just increase it by a couple of ones. So now it's 8, right, as you can see. Let's make a change again to one of those things that wasn't picked up before. Let's do both, actually. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say basic from fsapps update. I'm going to do the same for my immutable one, do update. I'm going to go into this one. I'm going to call the refresh endpoint. And now we see again that there are 2 keys that have changed, but that already worked. But this time, if I go in here, I do actually see the new values immediately. But note also that my number of calls has been reset to 1. So this explains already a little bit what's happening right now. When you have a refresh scope, what Spring will do is it's going to create a proxy, and that will act as your singleton that gets injected. And behind that is your real object that has its state and it has its configuration. When we call refresh now, what happens is that for all of your refresh scope proxies, they're going to get a new target. So Spring will basically just throw away your old instance that backs the proxy, and it creates new ones. And it does that for all of your refresh scope beans, right? So it's not smart in that it figures out, oh, what bean is using what configuration? Oh, only this configuration changed, I only need to do this. No, it's just across the board. It just recreates everything that has a refresh scope. But the nice thing is that it's a stable reference because of the proxy. Yeah, question?
So this means also that it works together with post-construction, for example?
Yes. The question was, does this also work with lifecycle annotations like pre-destroy, in this case? Actually, it does, and I can show you that. Because if we go into my controller now, what I added for the demo here is actually a method called pre-destroy. So whenever it's called, I'm just logging goodbye. And if we go to the output of my application, we will actually see this, right? You can see that the pre-destroy method was invoked. Also, if I would have had a post construct, it would have been indeed invoked for the new one. So you can see that this is really just a custom lifecycle, right? It's not a singleton. It's only in the scope of a single refresh, hence the refresh scope. Remember that I showed you that we can look at configuration properties here. This is still the old one. Now let's refresh and see what happens. This is now the configuration properties that it shows by default for my immutable configuration properties. It looks very weird. It has all sorts of properties that I didn't configure. It has a pre-filtered and it has a target source. That's because actually this thing is now showing the proxy. It's not showing the backing configuration properties. That might be confusing first time that you see that. It actually makes sense. And the good news is also that when we go to the configuration properties, next to this top level refresh scope proxy, you can actually see the other one. Because here you can see that we have a bean called scoped target dot immutable config. And that is actually the backing object, and that still has my regular keys and my regular values, right? So you can still find the current configuration over here. One more thing to demo before we continue with the presentation. I showed you in one of the slides that we can also do like live updates by posting to the environment. So I'm going to do a little demo of that one. If we go into my HTTP file, you can see that there is another request here. I have a request configured here where I'm doing a post to the actuator env endpoint, where I'm going to change my mutable key to something that ends in from the environment endpoints, right? So we can see that this value really came from here. And I can call this. Again, we're going to get back a response that shows what keys have been changed. And if we now go into the app and we do a refresh, we can see indeed that it has picked up on a new value. However, the value from this just came from a post request, right? So if this is not persistent. If I would restart my application, this thing would be gone. I cannot really come up with a good use case for this in a production environment, right? You never want to see configuration that isn't actually backed by any configuration source that's persistent, and that would change on a restart. But there are some really nice use cases for this. For example, in a staging environment where you have introduced a feature toggle, and now your tester comes up to you and they say, hey, you know what, I want to test what happens with a combination of these feature toggles enabled and this one disabled. Can you make it so and restart the application? Because very often testers don't have the ability to do this sort of thing themselves. They need to go into Kubernetes to restart applications or something. But now, you can just provide them with an endpoint and say, well, you can do that. As long as you make sure, of course, that all of the relevant code that you have is either reading from mutable configuration properties or is annotated with refresh scope, right? But that's, I think, a really nice use case for this. To make this work, by the way, you have to explicitly enable this because it's a dangerous feature. So you can see here that I have my management endpoint env post enabled set to true. And that's why this works. This does not work out of the box for good reasons, I would say. So with that, what happens under the covers when I do this stuff is that actually when I post to the refresh endpoint, there's going to be an event triggered, and there is a listener for that actually rebinds these configuration properties. It also reconfigures logger levels. I'm not going to demo that because, as I mentioned, there is already a loggers endpoint in the actuator that does the same thing, so I don't think it's that important. But what is important to realize, as I mentioned already, just driving the point home here, is that at refresh scope beans are these proxies, and whenever you call refresh, all of them will get a new target, right? And this is not a smart mechanism where it determines what configuration is used by what bean. It's just across the board, all of your refresh scope beans will be refreshed. So that's how it works. Now, this is nice, but as you saw in my demo, I need to just call this refresh endpoint now all the time that I make a change. That's not typically what you want. What you want is automatic refresh, right? I have configuration, I make a change, poof, it's visible in the app. Good news is, of course, that you can. And this is supported actually by a lot of configuration projects. So Spring Cloud actually has a lot of projects that support externalized configuration. In the keynote this morning, actually, Josh demoed the config server, which is by default backed by a Git repo, but it supports a lot of different backends. I'm going to demo something called Spring Cloud Consul, because it's easy to use for demos. From HashiCorp, they have Vault as well, which is like a full-blown secrets manager. I'm going to demo Kubernetes support. I want to do a shout-out to Spring Cloud AWS team here. Actually, 2/3 of the team is here at the conference, but they have done a great job in providing support for AWS Parameter Store, AWS Secrets Manager, using S3 for configuration, and all of those actually support reload as well. And the way that this typically works is that there's going to be some polling, or there's going to be some fancy callback mechanism, if you're lucky, that's more efficient, that tells your application, something has changed. And there are very good reasons for using one of these things. For example, also the fact that you can have shared configuration between microservices and stuff like that. This is not the presentation to actually go into that, but this is definitely worth checking out. And optionally, these applications can use a project that is called Spring Cloud Bus. So get onto the bus. Spring Cloud Bus is an abstraction that uses either MQP, so typically RabbitMQ, or Kafka, and it can broadcast these events. Now, it's interesting. I have been in this Spring community for 20 years already, and I know a lot of people who build Spring applications. I don't know anybody who even uses Spring Cloud Bus. So I was wondering here, can I see a show of hands? Who is even familiar with Spring Cloud Bus as a name? That's what I figured. It's like a half, because Tim has actually seen it, but he probably doesn't use it with Kafka. No, so that's also my experience. So I'm not actually going to cover this in this presentation, but be aware of the fact that there is this technology that will allow you, especially when you have a lot of different instances of applications, for example, to just publish these events by doing a pops up mechanism, basically. I am going to demo the refresh stuff, and for that, I'm going to use something called Spring Cloud Consul. So first, let me get to the project where I'm using Consul. So I'm going to reset my branch again. Going to stop my other application. And I'm going to show you what we have. So basically, I have an application now that is very similar to the one that I just demoed here. But it has a dependency on something that is called Spring Cloud Starter Consul config. Right? And I'm running Consul in a Docker image on localhost. So Consul is already there. Let me show you what this thing will actually do. First of all, no, actually, I'm just going to go immediately to Consul. It's probably better for the demo. Here I have Consul running. And Consul is a service discovery mechanism. It's a service registry, but it also has a key value store that you can use for configuration. That's what we'll be using. It's currently empty, as you can see. There's nothing here, like a welcome screen. So I'm going to create a new configuration key. And by default, your configuration for Spring applications that pick up their configuration from here needs to start with like a virtual folder called config. And then you can put in a key. So what we have now here is this config. That's just a prefix. Then the name of my application. My application is called Consul. So it's picking up configuration under the Consul folder. And then there is the name of my property. So that's the basic key. And I'm going to give this a value. So I'm going to say something like value from Consul, so that we can see that this thing actually came from here. Let's save. Let's start up my application now. So I should have a Consul application over here. And we can see that the controller again is doing the same thing, right? It has the basic key, it has the two config properties, and it's marked as refresh scoped, so it will pick up on all of the changes. Go back here. So the first thing that we see now is that we see our value from Consul, right? So at startup, it saw my change. This doesn't have anything to do yet with, of course, with dynamic refresh. It just shows that we can load configuration at startup. But now I can go back, and I can say I want to make a change to this thing. So let's go to Consul. Let's say go into this, take the basic key, value from Consul, update it, do a save. And now I'm not going to call the refresh endpoint or anything. I'm just going to go back into my app, Gonna do refresh, and you can see it has been updated, right? Magic. Actually, not magic. It's long polling. What happens? So the application now does a request, and then Consul keeps the response open until there actually is a change, and you can see that it again picked up on the refresh key here, but we didn't have to call the refresh endpoint. This is a change in configuration. If we see here, my mutable config key, for example, is still read from the class path. It's like a default that I have. I can also override this. So I can say I'm going to take this, I'm going to take the mutable config key, create a key for that, like this, and then say from console or something like that again to make sure that you can see it came from here. Do a save, go back into the app, refresh. You can see it picked up that value as well, right? So I can also introduce new values that override values from lower priority configuration sources. Now this is nice, but there are some gotchas. Something I want to show you, because it's important to realize, is what I've done on my mutable config properties object here is I've annotated it with @validated. This is a standard Spring Boot feature where you can say I want validation to be performed on my configuration. So if something is wrong at startup, my application will fail to start up, and it prints out a nice error message that says what the problem was. I have two things here. This is an int, so obviously I can only bind numbers to this. And this thing actually has a constraint, says the string needs to be at least 4 characters to work. So that's my key. Let's see what happens first if I break this by putting in a value that is not at least 4 characters. So I'm going to go into Consul again. Sorry, here. Going to get that key, and I'm going to change it to ABC, which is only 3 characters, obviously. Save. Now, before showing you anything else, I'm first going to show you what my app now does. So let's have a guess. Who thinks the app is actually not running anymore? Yeah. Who thinks it just shows ABC even though it doesn't validate? Yeah. And who thinks it shows the old value? Yeah. Actually, that's I think somewhat of a fair assumption, but it's wrong. So if I refresh here, you will see it just says ABC. But we have validation, right? So look at my application now. If we go into this one and we look at the console, ooh, there's something happening here. You can see that this thing every second now is just spitting out errors. And it's telling me I had an error with Consul, creating that mutable configuration properties because it couldn't bind. But this is a validation error that would normally, during startup, prevent your application from starting. But this application is already running. So it just binds anyways. Let me first correct this, and then I'll show you something else. So we're going to make this, again, a valid thing by just putting in an additional letter, right? We're going to save. We're going to see the new value, and we're going to see that this thing stops outputting all of these warnings and just tells me that the key has changed again. So we're back. We're good. I had this number as well. Let me look up the exact value for that. It was this one, mutable config.number. Let's create a key for that. So we can go in here. I'm going to create a new key. I'm going to call it this. First set it to a valid value, like 1. Do a save. Go here, refresh. We see the 1, as expected. Now, let's go back to Consul and say this number will be ABC. So again, show of hands. This is different, right? This is not a validation thing. This thing cannot bind. So what we will see. Any guesses? Just shout. What it turns out is not going to be 1, because 1 is the old value, and 1 is just a refresh scoped bean that's going away, so that's no longer there. So because it cannot actually bind, it will just be the default. And the default for an int, 0. Exactly. So if we save, we go here, we do refresh. It takes a while. Ooh, interesting. Did not expect this to happen. Okay, it's 1. I'm gonna figure out in a moment why this is. But what you do see is that this time it cannot bind at all, and this is different behavior, right? So it's important to test these things. You can see that it's so important to test this that I even had it wrong because probably when I prepared this, it was set to 0 instead of 1. But it's not doing what we wanted to do. Now, how do you make sure that you catch something like this happening? Because imagine you're running in a production environment, you have this stuff enabled, someone puts in the wrong value, your application starts logging like crazy, it now runs on the wrong configuration, but no one notices. That could be obviously a real problem. So what's good to know is that another thing that Spring Cloud will do is it gives me an additional health indicator, as it's called. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with that, but if we go in here and we go to actuator/health, I've enabled the details to be logged, so you can see that there's like a console and there is disk space indicators. But if I scroll down a bit, you will see that there is now also a refresh scope indicator. And the refresh scope indicator actually says it's down. And it's down because it has a problem with binding. So this is where you can see that there is a problem actually. And in this case, because by default all health indicators are used by the health endpoint, my whole application status is now down. It doesn't have to be like that. You can actually change this to say, I still want the refresh scope indicator to be there, but I don't want it to be used for the default health. But you can always query it separately. So here, I can go to /refresh scope, and I can just see the health indicator status, right? You can put it in a group. Spring Boot is pretty versatile in this sort of thing. But this is important to realize, right? You might be able to break stuff, and normally that would prevent your application from starting up. Here it's going to have some slightly different effects. But it is possible to monitor for this stuff and to act on it whenever it happens. So that's the important bit. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to demo. So let's stop this. Yes?
How is the behavior with the actuator refresh endpoint when I also do the configuration wrong?
That should override, because it will just update with a higher priority the total set of property sources.
Well, I mean, if I use the refresh endpoint instead of Consul is not running.
Ah, that's what you mean. It does the same thing. Yeah.
Instead of
No, it does the same thing. So basically, the automatic refresh does exactly what happens when you call the refresh endpoint yourself. So that's the same thing.
So can expect the same behavior.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So just to reiterate on the last point that I was showing, right? Binding and validation, if you're using that, can fail. I mean, binding can always fail. If you have things that are not just a string, but they are something else, might be a problem tying your configuration to it. If you use validation, obviously that can fail as well. But fortunately, we have this refresh indicator for that. And you should consider how to use this. Definitely make sure that you alert on this, right? If you're going to use this stuff running in production, obviously you want to have an alert. Not sure if you want to just put it in your default health endpoint and then have your application go into a crash loop whenever you refresh. But maybe this is actually what you want, right? It depends a little bit on what type of configuration, of course, you are expecting to be able to change at runtime. And it will not probably be everything. There will be a limited set of configuration that benefits from this stuff. But keep this in mind. Now, it's nice to show Consul, but you cannot go to any tech conference still without talking, of course, about Kubernetes. Because Kubernetes is the platform that we all love to hate because everyone is forced to run their applications on it. So just for you, I prepared a demo where I'm actually running Kubernetes on my laptop. Right? And I always refuse to do this stuff, but for the demo I will. Because a lot of you are running on Kubernetes. And if you are, then you know that on Kubernetes, you have something called a config map, which is like the default way of working with configuration within Kubernetes itself. Config maps can be seen by your application either because they're bound as environment variables, or because they're bound to a single file, or because they're bound to multiple files. And Spring Boot supports all of these mechanisms. And you also have dedicated secrets, which again are configuration values, but they're secrets. There is a project called Spring Cloud Kubernetes that actually allows you to refresh these sort of configuration values. And it has something where the application itself can dynamically reload its configuration, right? It creates a socket connection or it pulls. However, this support has been there for many years already, but has been deprecated since 2020. Right? So this support, if you ever find it, uses this configuration property, Spring Cloud Kubernetes reload enabled. You're not supposed to use it anymore. It's been deprecated for 5 years. It's probably one of the few features in the Spring ecosystem where they haven't just removed it, they just kept it as a deprecated thing. What you should be doing instead is you should be using something called the configuration watcher. And this is a separate application that you deploy into your Kubernetes cluster. And this application will monitor config maps, and if you want to, also secrets, but that's opt-in, you need to enable that, for changes. Then when something changes, it determines what application the configuration is for, and then it calls the refresh endpoint on that application. That's, in essence, how it works. So it fires events for this. And it doesn't do this for everything. So you might have a config map where you say, well, I don't really want to refresh if this thing changes. So by default, how this stuff works, your config map in Kubernetes needs to have a label, which is just key value pairs, that tells it this thing is, should be taken into account by the Kubernetes configuration watcher. There's a label for that, and I'll show you in a moment. If that label exists, and it finds a config map, and the config map is called my application, it will assume that you also have an application running a deployment that is called my application. So it must be the configuration for that application. And then, by default, it calls the actuator refresh endpoint, or it can use Spring Cloud Bus, if that's what you're using. It has various configuration options. You don't typically have to build this thing by itself. There is just a pre-made Docker image, and you can configure it with environment variables. But of course, it's a Spring open source project, so if you really want to, you can download this, you can change it, you can build your own version. One thing I wanted to point out here is this thing. Let's say that your application is consuming a config map by just mounting it on the file system as a properties file. That's quite a common thing to do. What happens then is if you update Kubernetes with the changed config map, it will take a while for the application to actually be able to see that change in the mounted file. Therefore, if the configuration watcher would immediately tell your file, hey, your configuration has changed. It says, oh, cool, I'm going to look for the new configuration. It just still sees the old one. So by default, this thing will wait for 2 minutes to tell your application that the configuration has changed, to give Kubernetes time to actually reflect the changes in your mounted file system. I've made that 30 seconds for my demo. Trial and error showed it was good enough, but let's see. You can also configure some other stuff. For example, maybe you have shared configuration, so you want config map to actually be notified to multiple applications. You can say which ones that should be. There's some other stuff as well. Let's have a look. So we're going to do another demo. My Kubernetes cluster is already running, but I'm going to show you the configuration that I'm going to use for this. So I'm going to reset this. There we go. And we're going to take my basic application that I already demoed, and that's the one that I've deployed to Kubernetes. But there is one thing I need to show you first. Let's start with that. In my application properties, I added this one line here. You can see that I have a Spring config import where I say, if it's there, make sure that you import this etc config application properties. And this is going to be my config map that will be mounted to my file system in the container. Right, so if it's there, it will pick it up. That's the only change I made to my application, because my application itself doesn't need to use Spring Cloud Kubernetes or anything. Right, it doesn't have any dependencies on that. It's this separate application that I'm about to deploy. So that application is actually here, and I have this config watcher deployment. I didn't write this file myself. I copy and pasted this from the documentation because they have a pre-made deployment descriptor basically for the configuration watcher. I just did one thing, and that's what I explained already, is I made sure that this timeout is configured. So there is this thing, the Spring Cloud Kubernetes configuration watcher refresh delay, and I've set it to 30 seconds rather than 2 minutes because otherwise we're all waiting for 2 minutes for something to happen here, and I don't have that much time. Everything else is default. And there is a lot of configuration here because this thing needs a lot of access, right? It needs to be able to look at configuration maps, maybe secrets as well. It needs to be able to call other applications. So you don't have to worry about how to configure this. It's already in here. And I already did the deploy as well. Then this is the deployment of my application. Not very exciting. It just tells me that I have my application. I have a Docker image of that. So I just use the built-in build pack support to create that. And I'm deploying it. The only thing important is this one, the volume mount. You can see that I'm mounting my config map on etc config. That's why I can import that application properties from there. And then finally, we have the config map. So the config map is just something that looks like this, very simple. You can see that in this case, I've put in an application properties as a single thing, and it has my, my 3 values there. And you can see that this is already deployed in Kubernetes. I could do it in something like K9s on the console, but actually IntelliJ has pretty good support for working with Kubernetes. So if we go here, then we can see my Docker desktop Kubernetes cluster running. And in my configuration here, I can see that there is a config map called basic, and it has an application properties. And if I open it up, I can see that it is indeed what I configured here that is now available in Kubernetes. So let me look at the application. I think it's already running. So this is bound to another port number, so it doesn't conflict. And in this case, I did a little demo already. So the first one is already been updated, and we see the two other values. Let's update the mutable config and see if it works. So I'm going to go into my config map. Actually, I probably didn't. Yeah, never mind. I'm going to update the mutable config. I'm going to set this to updated during the talk, because I had this other thing that was already updated. I'm going to right-click. I'm going to say I'm going to apply this to my cluster. Right? You can see it does the kubectl thing. Now it should be running in my cluster, and now somewhere within the next 30 seconds, it is going to update my application. You can monitor for stuff that happens here actually. So for example, if I go here in the workload section, I can see that I have my applications running. I have my own application and I have the Kubernetes watcher. And you can actually look into the logs for that. You can see that this thing is now doing some logging, and it's showing me over here that it has refreshed something. Let me check out the application. Oh, actually it picked up on the previous config map change now, as you can see, right? So this one is now back to the default, but this one hasn't been picked up yet. And that's, again, like I said, this is probably because it takes a little bit of time. And my 30 seconds, which turned out to be enough in my preparations, was probably just not long enough when I'm actually doing the live demo, because this is live demos. Good news is, I can still demo that this actually works by just making another change, because that will trigger another configuration endpoint update. And will probably just be one version behind the current configuration, because my 30 seconds wasn't long enough. But let's give it a quick try. Not to worry here, so we're going to go back here. We're going to make another one, update it as well. We're going to publish the config map. There we go. And what I do actually expect now is that what we will see, because like I said, the 30 seconds probably is a little bit too short, is that we will see this update in a moment's time, but we'll probably miss this one, because it turned out my 30 seconds wasn't long enough. But that's fine. It still shows the whole mechanism and actually why this delay is important. And you need to figure out what the correct value is for your environment. And better err on the longer side than on the shorter side, or you'll see this. Not sure if I already talked for 30 seconds. Yeah, there we go. So this is exactly what I expected, right? We can see that my first update came through, but because it didn't see the final update yet, it didn't catch on to the other one. So 30 seconds may not actually be enough. This is especially true if you're mounting the whole config map as a file, right? If you're consuming it in another way, for example, through environment variables, it's going to be quicker, I think. But again, do your own testing and make sure that you know how this stuff works for your particular cluster and environment. But this shows that we can also do dynamic reloading of Kubernetes configuration. And your application itself doesn't need to be aware of Kubernetes Spring project. It just needs to have the basic Spring Cloud configuration support enabled, because it's a separate app that actually does the updating. So, who, after seeing this, thinks, hey, this might be interesting for my own applications to use? Okay, that's quite a lot of people. So that was sort of my goal, obviously, for this presentation. There are some things you need to keep in mind when you start to look into this yourself. First of all, if you start to read documentation, you will find a lot of it is outdated, because it still references something called a bootstrap context. This is an old Spring Cloud concept, where they would first create like a parent application context and then have a child. Most of this stuff is obsolete, because Spring Boot has actually absorbed a lot of this logic already. So just be aware of that. Also, as I demoed, unless you want to use refresh scope everywhere, make sure that when you use a configuration properties class, that you always call the accessor, you always call the getters, basically, so you can see the latest values. That prevents you from having to use refresh scope everywhere, which may be good, right? You don't always necessarily want to just have like a new instance of your bean. Also, secure your actuator endpoints. As I mentioned, enabling posts on the env endpoint, I wouldn't typically do that in production anyways. because I cannot really come up with good use cases for it, but it's definitely nice in staging. But on production, make sure that your refresh endpoint is just not accessible to the whole world, right? You don't want people to just do like a denial of service attack by continuously letting you refresh all of your applications and stuff like that. Some other notes. When you are using crack, this sounds weird, but this is checkpoint restore. What that means is that you're going to reduce your startup time by a lot by basically creating a pre-compiled image of your application. It's not like GraalVM, it still is a full VM with reflection and everything, but it does already have your configuration typically. So you can combine that with this to make sure that if you're using crack, you can still see the current configuration values when you start up your application. In this same room at 2 o'clock, there is actually a whole presentation that talks about things like Crack, Project Leiden, and some of the other initiatives for improving the performance of the startup of your applications. A use case for this stuff is to rotate database credentials. And you can. A lot of people do this. You just create a data source bean, make it at refresh scopes. However, don't do it with Hikari. It doesn't like it if it's being killed while you have open connections. And Hikari is the default connection pool. So switch to a different connection pool if you want it to be able to dynamically reload with new connection settings basically for your database. If you are on something like AWS and you're using a managed database, you don't really need this. They have dedicated support, right? I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but just know that there is a library actually from AWS itself. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Where it has support for reloading credentials and reconnecting and stuff, right? So this concern is also covered by other options. And finally, if you want to use GraalVM with this stuff, yeah, you can't. It's not supported, so don't do that. Yeah, I cannot make it nicer than it is. That's how it is. As I mentioned already, as a demo, right? Beware of things like binding errors and partial updates that could happen to your application. So eventually, you need to test this stuff, obviously, because it's at the core of your application, right? Configuration is a pretty important concern. Wrong configuration can break your application or do worse than that. So test this. Use the health indicator for this. To see if everything works. And also make sure that you validate what happens by just having a look at the output of the environment and the config props actuator endpoints, because these show the actual truth of what Spring thinks that your current configuration looks like. And that will help you tremendously. And then have fun with this, because like I said, this is a very little known feature. That's why I wanted to do this talk on it. I thought it would be nice to show people what is actually possible there, instead of just having to restart your application all the time and wait for it to come back up and then say, oh, now we have a new configuration property, right? So with that, thank you for attending. You can find my code examples if you want to run this stuff yourself here on GitHub. It has a Docker Compose for the Consul. It has the Kubernetes deployment descriptors. So you will be up and running in no time to try this stuff out yourself. And I think, yeah, we have 2 minutes. So any questions? Yeah? Add conditional annotations? No. Add conditional is used to determine what actually is created in terms of application context in beans. So, no, but again, conditional on property is used to define what the contents of the application context itself will be. This does not restart your application context. It only refreshes the configuration. So it would be, no, so the short answer is no. It doesn't make sense to say I'm going to have a conditional on property and then change that property, because you would need to restart your application context for that. There is actually support for that, I think, through a custom endpoint or through a property where you can say when I refresh I want to just restart. But that would be a different use case than what I demoed now. No, so indeed for stuff that is only used at startup, you have to start up, is basically the answer there. Any other questions? Okay, then thank you very much, and enjoy the conference.